Greetings and welcome to the 12th Annual Global Ethics Day. My thanks to those of you who are here in person and to those of you who are watching online. Last year we had broad participation across 70 countries for Global Ethics Day, including hundreds of organizations and thousands of individuals. And this year we're hoping for more. Given the intensity of world events that are leading to fracture and disharmony, we believe there's a need and an opportunity to take a day to focus on our common humanity. And this is what Global Ethics Day is all about. Global Ethics Day is a moment for us to reflect together on the values and principles that shape our lives. It's a grassroots effort as individuals and organizations plan their own activities and network with us to platform, connect, and amplify their efforts. Over the years, we've been inspired by listening and learning from thought leaders and exemplars of ethical leadership at all levels of society and in every part of the world. Activities have ranged widely from organizing events like debates, panel discussions, classroom activities, and productions of videos and podcasts, to organizing community programs like environmental cleanups and tree plantings. All of the activities have one thing in common. They all illustrate how ethics matter and how ethics can empower us to build a better world. Today here at Carnegie Council, with our panel discussion, we want to highlight a particular ethical principle: humanitarianism. We all know humanitarianism has endured an especially challenging year. On the face of it, one would not think that the idea of the equal moral worth of every human being would be controversial. But the challenge is in implementation, as nationalist and populist sentiments are ascending, and hard power options like borders and armaments are being prioritized over foreign development assistance and relief programs. Here in the United States, USAID and SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, have been cut, while Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, are increased dramatically. Around the world, we see ongoing humanitarian crises in Gaza, Sudan, Ukraine, and Congo, just to name a few, and I could go on. Despite these tragic facts and strong headwinds, great work is being done by humanitarians working in international organizations, NGOs, philanthropies, churches, and other civically minded efforts. Today, we want to focus on some of these efforts. As I was preparing these remarks, I revisited previous Global Ethics Day conversations. In one moment, with Michael Schur, the TV comedy writer and author of the book, How to Be Perfect, really stood out for its combination of realism and idealism. As we like to say here at Carnegie Council, realism plus ethics. When asked about his approach to ethics, Michael replied, and I quote, "Even the purest of philosophers, the most rigorous and intense philosophers, didn't necessarily believe that you had to be perfect or that you had to nail everything. It was simply, here's a way to make perhaps a better choice than the one you were about to make." So yes, those problems don't get solved if ethics is a more fundamental part of human life, but they are lessened. What are we here for if not to lessen pain, agony, and the anguish for people the world over? End of quote. And well said. We hope to highlight more along this line today with our panelists as they discuss the current state of their work, as well as their challenges, trade-offs, and best ideas of how to find new solutions to the challenge of humanitarianism. And I'll now introduce the panelists, and I'm going to toss it over to Melissa to be our moderator. We have Aurélien Boufflers, Chief of Policy Planning, UN Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, well known as OCHA, and Nadia Dar, Chief Strategy and Impact Officer Amnesty International USA. Anjali Dayal, Associate Professor of Fordham University. And our moderator is Melissa Matani, Executive Producer and International Journalist. So my sincere thanks to all of you for being here, and I'm going to toss it to Melissa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joel. It certainly does feel dire at the moment. I don't think we can escape that, but I'm particularly grateful to the Carnegie Council for gathering us all here today, those of you in the room and those of you online, to actually put some time aside for us to focus on the challenges, very much how we got here, but also the solutions. So I really want to thank you. And since Joel introduced us, I'm going to dive straight in. We will be taking some audience questions from both of you and all of you in the room and again, watching online. So please stay engaged and submit those questions. But to start us off, I'm really interested to know from each of your perspectives how you've seen attitudes towards humanitarianism change and potentially why. So Anjali, starting with you, you teach young people. They're supposed to be the hope of the next generation. Have you seen this hope increase or fade in recent years? Set the scene for us.
Well, so first I want to say I'm lucky enough to have some students here today, which is wonderful. We can think, I think, about a sort of like global shift in the way we think about hope as being reflected through students. I first started teaching right before the first Obama administration. My first semester teaching was the lead up to that election. That was a very different attitude towards hope, I think. That was a hopeful zeitgeist, right? It was a time when people were looking at the shape of the world and thinking like, how progressively could we make changes that might better value the life of every person? And you saw that reflected in the classroom, right? I would say by my lights, thinking about teaching now for all of that time, the big shift that I saw was in 2020, right? Where, students living through a once in a century pandemic came face to face, as did all of us, right? With the fact that people don't always show up for each other, right? People don't always make, as Mike Schur said, the better choice, right? Sometimes they make the selfish choice. And that, I think, made me reconsider meaningfully how I taught, because international relations, which I teach, is not by nature a hopeful discipline, right? It often shows people the worst face of how people behave, right? It takes the worst argument about the way that people can be and translates it into axiomatic truth. But that's not the only way the world can be, right? And something that I've noted is that despite having sort of moved through a once in a century pandemic, right? And I'm very lucky, I'm not exactly sure what they do at the Fordham admissions office, right? But they tend to have, and I said they were here because I'm going to embarrass them just a little bit, right? They tend to be able to select earnest, thoughtful students who want to be engaged in the world, right? And thinking about that as being a face of hope, that's something you can mobilize, means that you can say, look, there's not just one way people are with each other, right? There are all of these different kinds of ways people are in the world. And yes, you may see the worst face of people sometimes, right? But you know from looking around the world, from looking at the work that humanitarian organizations do, from looking at the work that human rights advocates do, you know there are people who are on the ground, right? Whose job it is to try and think about a better world, right? And then in the room, we have the luxury of thinking, what are the ways that that could go better, right? What are the ways that falls short? And in that sense, it is a hopefulness that is, like the abolitionist thinker Miriam Kaba says, hope is a discipline, right? Or like the feminist thinker Rebecca Solnit says, hope not as a lottery ticket that you sit and wait for something better to happen, but as an axe, right? That you use to beat down the obstacles to a better habitable future.
And that's so interesting. And I want to come back and hear more about that axe that you use in a minute. But Nadia, I'm interested. And, you're now at Amnesty, before you were at Oxfam, and a lot of your work actually involves speaking to people on Capitol Hill, speaking to a lot of the politicians that control the purse strings when it comes to funding humanitarianism. Anjali mentioned 2020. Was that also a similar shift, or have you seen attitudes shift in a different way?
Yeah, and 2020 is such an interesting year to think about because it was a time where, the globe had to come together to face a major global challenge. And there was this pivotal moment. Is the US going to step up and play its role with respect to, for example, access to vaccines that were being produced at that time? Was the US and countries together going to come together and provide financing, concessional, so grant financing for countries around the world that were struggling in this dire moment economically in the face of the pandemic? But I think it is really interesting to take the historical perspective here when we think about the US, because I think a lot of people are looking at what's happening today with this abrupt slashing of US funding around the world. And I think it is really important for us to put it in perspective. And when we look over the last several decades, we look at what came out of World War II. World War II was a pivotal moment for the globe to come together around humanitarian principles, around human rights principles, around multilateralism. And that was an important moment for financing of humanitarian assistance as well. Post-World War II reconstruction efforts and the role that the US played was pivotal. And it set the scene for global financing in that moment. Some of the key institutions that were founded coming out of that moment were institutions like the World Bank, and followed from that many other multilateral financial institutions that have provided financing around the country. But the US has also been a leader in many regards over the years, right? Even in 1950, Senator Monroney was, a senator within the US who actually proposed the idea of the International Development Association of the World Bank, which would be a grant arm for the World Bank. This is now the single biggest provider of essential services funding around the world today. These things came from individuals and from collective mobilization around these moments. 1960s, when the USAID was created, and it was bipartisan over the years, right? So foreign assistance has not been just a Democratic Party mandate or proposal or promotion. It was really a bipartisan, and it has had bipartisan support. George W. Bush is credited with initiating the PEPFAR initiative, which has saved millions of lives with HIV and AIDS funding. It's important to understand the important, central role that the U.S. plays, and how policymakers in the US have really understood the impactful role that the US can play, both for harm, and we've seen the immense harm that this government can have with its foreign policy, but also its capacity for good.
But actually, so one of the things that also came out of the UN, because I'm going to unpack a little bit of what you've been talking about in a minute. One of the things that came out of the Second World War was the UN already, and I'd love to bring you into this discussion, because you're right that people did set up these fantastic institutions, and that's where global attention was. But, as we're reimagining what humanitarianism looks like, a lot of these institutions have become so institutionalized that perhaps they're not as effective as they were. And Ryan, you are here sort of representing the UN. I mean, the UN has had a really bad rap recently. And I'm interested to know, again, as we're talking about just setting the scene of how attitudes have changed, attitudes have certainly changed towards the UN. How are you receiving this? Because your office is actually planning and implementing aid on the ground.
Look, I mean, you need to hear criticism, and not all of them are actually bad. We need to, I mean, the world is changing. We need to hear people who call on the UN to change with the world. When you, for instance, in the humanitarian field, which I represent here, when you hear communities we serve, when you hear government telling you that the assistance you provide doesn't meet the expectation of their needs, that they want to be more involved, that they want to participate in decisions that concern them, you need to hear that, and you need to adapt to that and adjust your system. And that's what we're trying to do at the UN. So I think there are very positive criticism of the UN. Then you have criticism about, the UN being a bureaucracy and being inefficient. And yes, I mean, some of it is true. I think there is a bureaucracy. and we need to reduce layers of bureaucracy, and we're constantly adapting to that. But I think we also need to dig a bit deeper and try to understand what this criticism mean. Because to give you an example, WFP, the World Food Program, can save a life, feed someone for 50 cents a day. That's less than $200 a year. That's pretty efficient and effective, in my opinion. So maybe the debate about efficiency and bureaucracy is about something else. And in my opinion, I think first there's a confusion about what the UN is. When I speak to not humanitarians or UN staff, but people, in my family, in my friends, when they say the UN is inefficient, they speak about the UN not resolving the conflict in Gaza, the UN not resolving the conflict in Darfur. Well, that's not UN agencies. That's really the political part of the UN and the difficulty member states have to come together, and the Security Council in particular, to find solutions. So already you need to differentiate between the two. And then when you look at some of the criticism on inefficiencies and why, for instance, assistance is going to refugees and not to people here, I think here we're in something deeper, which is real battle of values, to be honest, and battles about whether we want to defend humanitarianism or not. I mean, I belong to those who believe that any human being suffering should be supported, wherever he or she is and whatever his or her values are. Obviously, this is not the consensus anymore. So we need, I think, to engage in this dialogue and try to explain why we think it's in the interest of everyone, of humanity, to take your words before, to in fact help each other across countries.
Well, so Nadia, you mentioned the huge USAID cuts, right? And they happened earlier this year, and it really was a watershed moment for international aid, because the US was the biggest funder of global aid in how it had existed. But also, and a lot of the rhetoric that people heard was there was a lot of waste. Now, some of this was clearly taken out of context. You'll all remember the condoms for Gaza, which was Gaza province in Mozambique, not actually Gaza. And so, that has not helped the cause. But, starting with you, Aurélien, and I'll come back around this way. But I mean, Aurélien, do you think, again, is this fair to say there is so much waste that this should be a reckoning moment where we can address the huge waste that has existed just because it's become institutionalized for ages?
I mean, is it a lot of waste? Look, to give you an example, UNICEF and WHO managed to almost eradicate polio over the past 30 years at a price which is twice less than what government usually spend. So again, for me, it is pretty efficient. Now, do our system needs to adapt to a new reality? Absolutely. But I think for me, for the humanitarian world, the struggle with this adaptation, the equation that we need to solve is, on the one hand, we need to hear people who want to see a different humanitarian system with new actors coming in with different values, different ways of working, and open this system to them while preserving the humanitarian values, I would say, and that's not a given. I think, given the funding constraints now on humanitarians, I think we also need to go back to our very original mission, which is really emergency relief. And that means that we need some other actors like the World Bank, like the IFIs, like some development actors to be much more forward-leaning in some countries. Today, I mean, when I started in this business, OCHA used to stay maybe 1-2 years in an emergency. Today, we stay 20-30 years because the peace and security part of international relations is broken, because from that, the development is struggling. And we see that today, for instance, in Afghanistan or in Syria, where we want to support communities, but we're also saying it is not humanitarians who are going to get people out of that. And we need development actors, we need IFI, we need politicians to re-engage so humanitarians can actually get out of these countries and focus on Gaza, focus on Darfur, focus on DRC, where you have emergency right now.
And Nadia, again, when you're going to Capitol Hill and you're speaking to all of these people, waste has been a big topic. A lot of people talk about these USAID cuts. Do they have better ideas?
I mean, I think there's a few parts to this, right? So first, is aid and has aid in the way that it has been distributed the most efficient? We absolutely need to be questioning and making sure that resources are being used in the best way possible to reach those that need that aid in the most efficient way. So can there be more efficiencies? Absolutely. Was that a narrative that was consistently used in order to cut USAID and to cut foreign assistance? Absolutely. And so we also need to dispel the myth that if we had shown that USAID and aid was being used efficiently, that we wouldn't have seen the same outcome. This administration is also looking at multilateralism and foreign assistance in a different normative way, as we were just hearing, right? So it's not just about efficiency, it's about the US's role in the world, and it's about moving towards more of a transactional understanding of the role of the US and of aid. There are other narratives, for example, that a lot of US money is going towards aid. Actually, in 1970, countries around the world agreed with a UN commitment of rich countries would use 0.7% of their gross national product in supporting countries that needed it with foreign assistance, with aid. The US is nowhere close to that. There is this myth that Americans have been fed that a lot of our budget is going towards aid. It is around 1%. It's been, hovering around that figure for a long time. So there's a lot there that needs to be dispelled. But I think it's really important to also understand the benefits that have come from these aid programs. Polio eradication, close to polio eradication is one of those examples. HIV/AIDS is another one that I mentioned that is really important to understand. Education and girls' education around the world has progressed significantly over the years. And I think it's been difficult over the years to tell that story. And what is the counterfactual? What if aid had not been there? But actually, we're at the moment right now where we can see that counterfactual, because we can see what impact these abrupt and drastic cuts in USAID and foreign assistance more broadly are having. Amnesty's research and many others have researched the impacts. We've seen that girls and women who are survivors of gender-based violence in Yemen no longer have health services, no longer have psychosocial services that they had before. We've seen in Haiti similar things. We've seen at the Thai-Myanmar border in areas where there are internally displaced populations who had access to services, as a result of them facing violence. Those services no longer existing. People no longer having oxygen that they were relying on and dying from not having these services anymore. So the counterfactual that we haven't had all these years, we now have it. And we're going to have a devastating set of stories to tell, and the US has a key responsibility in that.
And so, Anjali, you teach international relations. Clearly, as you've both alluded to, that will that was there is no longer there. The US's role is different. So when we look to reimagining the future of humanitarianism, what are some of the solutions or the new ideas that you put on the table and discuss with your students?
Yeah, so first I just want to pick up quickly on one of those points. When we think about efficiency, when we think about waste, right? If every person's life matters equally, which we should believe, right? Then the projection is that USAID cuts will produce 14 million excess deaths in the next 5 to 10 years. That is waste, right? That is waste of the worst kind, right? Waste that cannot be rectified. There's no repair for that, right? And so when we think about that, then we also have to acknowledge the fact that the way the aid system was built was never sustainable, right? It was always pegged to the idea that the US would always play the same role in the world, right? The contemporary aid system that we have today is built around the idea that the great American military and the sort of the great power of the American military and the sort of great economic might of the American state would always be turned towards this particular kind of liberal institutionalism. But we've known that since the beginning because there's always been a countercurrent in American politics that might not always be the case, right? And so when we think about reimagining aid, we have to imagine a world in which sustainable aid systems are not tied to the idea that the most powerful country in the world will always be exactly the same, right? And we have to imagine a world where what we see is more community-focused aid, right? Aid that comes from the needs and incentives of local populations, that is sustained by the efforts of wealthy countries, but that is driven by the people who will have to live with the consequences of decisions, right?
I mean, you suggesting that, deaths are waste is a very, very good way of looking at it, which people don't think about. And this comes back to storytelling and communicating and, really getting the narrative out there to quieten the one that we're hearing that potentially isn't always correct coming from various officials. I want to talk about storytelling in a moment, but in terms of community focus, one of the reasons that we are seeing this shift inwards is because of the rise of populist leaders, not just in the US, but around the world. It's being presented, and Nadi, you alluded to this, is an us versus them game. Like giving money to them isn't enough for us. But this isn't true, as you laid out. I mean, if this is how people are feeling, how do we combat that?
Yeah. I think it's a really good question, and I think narratives are difficult, especially when some of us have access to controlling social media companies, and others may be sitting on a stage having a conversation. But it's important that we're all part of that conversation and that we're all playing our part there. There is this narrative, as you were saying, of this us versus them, and it's really increasingly what we're seeing with these populist leaders is this idea of zero-sum rights, right? That you can't all have universal human rights. It's this anti-universalist understanding of the world. And it's this promotion of this idea that if you want to have foreign assistance, that's going to impact our healthcare system. If you want to have foreign assistance, we can't really afford post-secondary education. It's not because of aid that we don't have universal free access to healthcare in this country. It's not because of aid that we don't have workers' security in this country. It's not because of aid that we are now facing a migrant crisis in this country and what is actually being posed as a migrant crisis. Another zero-sum narrative that is being pushed out, right? That if you want to have economic rights, we can't also have migrant rights. And I think we really need to get back to this idea of universalism and this idea that every single human life is a universe, every single life has value, and everyone is deserving of dignity and human rights. And when you step into that universalist idea, I think it really reframes the story.
But, so at the moment, the US government is shut down, right? And yet we saw yesterday President Trump is bailing out Argentina. There was a meeting at the Oval Office. So when you're talking about money being directed in different ways, potentially people just don't understand these various mechanisms, what goes to aid, what's allotted to this. I mean, is that part of what you're teaching, Anjali, or what you need to explain, just actually how the various mechanisms work?
Yeah, we live in a world where this stuff is often opaque to people who are very well informed even, right? Who don't necessarily know how the mechanisms of aid work, how the mechanisms of distribution work. And in that sense, it becomes really important, I think, for people with deep expertise to become good at public communication. And that's, I think, tough because it's not, I think, a given skill. It's not necessarily something that everyone who has deep expertise, whether on the ground, whether sort of academic, is trained to do. But a lot, I think, of the situation that we find ourselves in is because the people who have deep expertise are not necessarily in the position to make it most transparent and to make it most available, right? We live in a world where understandably, deep expertise is paywalled, right? And misinformation is free. And in that sense, right, trying to think about ways that you can facilitate a world of open knowledge and communicating. How does this work? How much is the average US citizen actually spending on this, right? Where does this money go? What is it doing? Why does it matter? All of these things, people have lives, they're busy, they have to get through the day. They need someone to help them see what the sort of mechanisms of this are, because it's not out of necessarily lack of interest or selfishness that they don't see it. We all have lives, right? This just happens to be the way that we make our particular living. And in that sense, that becomes our task, I think.
And also as a journalist, I mean, I can say as a fact that, you know, the fake news travels much, much faster than any of the real news that follows once you do all the fact checking and correcting. Nobody's reading the small print, which is very frustrating, but we'll save that for another time. When we talk about community funding and different ways of funding, coming back to the USAID cuts, one solution that has been presented, and already, and I'm really interested to get your thoughts on this, is philanthropy. We have seen a lot of philanthropic institutions pour money, you know, to try and fill this gap. Now, you know, a lot of people might not know, but even with all of that money, it's no match to what the US was actually spending. A lot of people, again, just don't appreciate how much money that was. But is philanthropy, can it replace, when we think about different ways of funding? Like, talk to me a little bit about implementation, because money is one thing, but why the UN has been so successful is because it actually has these relationships which are very difficult to implement aid on the ground.
Look, I mean, first, I was about to echo your point. It's of course welcome that philanthropies get more and more involved in supporting aid and get in this sector. But just in terms of proportion, we're talking about maybe a couple of billions altogether, while the total industry of humanitarian assistance only, and that's not development aid, is about 40 billion. So without states, including the US, but also others, is difficult. Having said that, I think it's great that the philanthropies are coming in and are sharing their experience, their ideas, their capacity. I think the UN and humanitarian organization can benefit greatly from that. I think philanthropies can also benefit greatly of our experience in working in an environment like armed conflict where they're not used to work, from decades of experience in assisting people. So I don't think it's either or. I think it's really how we work together, and we build a system, to Anjali's point, around people affected and communities where different organizations come together around common objectives. For us, while we do that, what is important is that we don't lose sight what different organizations come with different identities, framework, and principles. And in particular on the UN side, on the humanitarian side, we don't want to lose sight of the humanitarianism part of our work. Because aid is not only bringing goods from a place from A to B, that's logistics. And logistics is an important part of assistance, but it's only one tiny part. It's the what. What's also important is the why we're doing it. And the why is to what Nadia said, Ajay said, because we believe that any person on this planet should be protected and assisted if he or she suffers, and we should do it for free. This person should not have to pay. And then the second point is the how we do it. We work in extremely complex environment. I mean, think about Gaza now, think about Darfur, think about Somalia or Haiti. You can really hurt people. And we've seen in Gaza a couple of months ago how an operation, which in my opinion was not really well thought through, resulted in thousands being killed. So the how we're doing it, how we make sure, for instance, that it's not the strongest to get assistance first, but it's actually the most vulnerable. I'm thinking about kids. Kids will not come to you asking for assistance. You have really to have the expertise and experience. And I think that's where the partnership between philanthropies, UN agencies, NGOs becomes important. There's place for everyone. It's not either or. And I think there's resources in this world for everyone.
So if you were to redesign the UN system as it currently is to partner more with philanthropies, how would you set things up differently?
Well, that's what we're thinking about now as part of the UNAT and the whole humanitarian reset that my boss, Tom Fletcher, launched. Look, I mean, the starting point is very often, if we started from scratch now, how would it look? Well, we're not starting from scratch. So I'm living in the real world. There are some institutions who are not going to disappear or not disappear anytime soon. So we need to deal with the cards we have right now. But I think the key aspects for me, and I don't have the exact details, but it's really how we go, to put it simply, from a, in a way, supply-driven and template-driven system to a system which starts from the people affected and the communities affected, and where these people are not seen as only recipient of assistance, but are seen as decision makers, are people who are taking care of themselves, and think how we can support them. And that sounds very theoretical, but it's a real flip in the way we think about our programming and international assistance.
It's more not just aid, but investment. And this is what we're seeing a lot of philanthropies do. I mean, to be fair, you know, you talked about it, Nadia, when all of these systems were set up after the Second World War. If you think about just the advancements in technology, you know, none of us had mobile phones and none of us were using AI. The world has changed. And so now a lot of these systems need to change to meet the moment, not just because of where the lack of desire is, but it's this kind of acceptance of this was just the way that things have been done. A lot of this does come down to communication and storytelling, as both of you said. So whenever people think about aid, you know, we think about, oh, there's such a big need. Oh, it's too much. But there actually is a lot of good going on in the world. I'm really interested to hear from each of you a good success story of humanitarianism that people might just not be as familiar with. And then we can kind of work backwards to think how storytelling or better storytelling could have helped. Anjali, starting with you.
Yeah, let me pick up, I think, a point that both of you made about polio eradication, right? In 1988, there were 350,000 cases of polio in 125 countries. In 2010, there were 1,292 cases in 4 countries. That is a massive success. That is a massive success produced by vaccination campaigns, right? Produced by efforts coordinated through the World Health Organization, produced by the funding of wealthy countries and the technical expertise of people on the ground, right? Because that worked, nothing happened, right? Which is the fundamental challenge, I think, of trying to dramatize humanitarian aid and assistance. When it goes well, what you produce is peace, stability, something that looks like nothing, right? We are very good. We have a whole language for war, for death, for crisis, for things that we can count, right? Because this campaign was successful, your child isn't going to be exposed to polio. Nothing happened, right? And that means that at the end of the day, probably what has to happen is to dramatize the actual act of assistance, right? And then to be able to tell stories person to person, place to place about what the difference makes. And it's tough, I think, because people who do this kind of work, we hope don't do it for the valor of it, right? But at the end of the day, dramatizing the action is probably the thing that's going to make it front and center. And we actually see the effect of not publicizing the success, right? People take it for granted. They don't understand that they live in a world where protective measures produce peace and security, right? They think that's the baseline condition. They think health is the baseline condition, right? Because they can't see the sort of massive systems of aid, assistance, technical expertise, willingness on the parts of people to let their child be vaccinated, right? That produces this kind of outcome.
I mean, it's such a great point to actually just think that success is when nothing happens.
Yeah.
You know, and this actually fuels a lot of the us versus them, because it's, again, the US, which is a very wealthy country, is funding all of these poorer countries because perspective matters. Here, it's very common to hear a lot of people complain about the UN because they don't see it in action in the same way. So, for example, as a child growing up in Zambia, you know, the UN was seen as like all the sort of saviors that were coming in to treat people, so they were really appreciated because there was a need. So I'm really interested to get your take on that, Nadia, but then also I'd love to hear a success story from your point of view as Amnesty.
Yeah, and actually the word choice that you used there in terms of savior, I think is another perspective, right? I mean, we're talking about the way different people see aid, and that's one of them. Actually, you put it in a positive light, but many see that also in a negative light, right? In terms of the post-colonial type way in which aid has been distributed. And it's something that I think that is worthwhile interrogating further, is how do you localize aid and make aid more meaningful for those on the ground? Picking up on what you were talking about earlier, how do you make sure that those communities who are most impacted or who need it most are taking part in the decision making? So just going back to that idea of like what kinds of reforms aid, again, it's not perfect. And it's important that as we're sitting here defending and talking about, it's hard for us to even criticize it because we're scared of how that will be manipulated, honestly. But there is a lot to critique. And it's important that we are not talking about it as a perfect system, but one that requires us to keep editing and refining, not abandoning. In terms of success stories, there are multiple. And I think it's really important for us to understand it's not just about counting the number of wells built or counting the number of schools built, right? It's about dignity and human rights that have been progressed over decades in many of these countries. But I want to focus on one area that I think many don't know too much about. And it's this idea of civil society and organizations that have been funded around the world to do human rights defense work, to do anti-corruption work, to actually make sure that their governments are using these resources more efficiently and more effectively. A lot of the foreign assistance that the US has been providing over the years, and Europeans as well, has been going towards civil society organizations and allowing civil society to thrive in ways that they wouldn't have been able to without that assistance. And I think it's just one area that we don't talk about a lot, but there's a whole ecosystem that has been disrupted through these cuts, and civil society and organizations' ability to hold their governments accountable is a really important one that I think it's important people are aware of.
It's a really good point. And actually, this year has been the deadliest year for humanitarian workers around the world. And Gaza is just, a prime example of that. And these people really are brave and are doing terrible, well, I mean, they're doing very brave work, but in terrible, terrible conditions, which, also needs to be communicated. And I think, Aurélien, a lot of people don't understand just the obstacles that exist in trying to get aid into a lot of places that you're working in, and also the big risks that people are taking. How can the UN do a better job of communicating?
Look, for me, I was thinking when you asked me a good example, I mean, we spoke about polio, I spoke about WFP, I was thinking about, the big system OCHA built with member states to respond to natural disasters. I mean, we can deploy teams around the world within 12 hours of any natural disasters and unblock millions of dollars within 24 hours. Nobody else can do that today. And it's very practical. In Syria during the earthquake and in Turkey, that's what saved thousands of lives. But for me, to your point, I think we need to tell the human story. And the human story, I used to say to my colleagues, aid is real. I remember working in DRC, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the North Kivu. And I remember this terrible situation where a community was trapped between armed groups for weeks. And they were displaced in a field without shelter, without medical care. And finally, after weeks, we can finally access them. And you can imagine what the sight was to see these people who had slept for weeks, with no shelter, no food, no water. I mean, it was a very difficult situation. And I remember these kids who were like about to die, literally. So we arrive, and of course, we start our work. And I go back there 2 weeks later, and you see these kids who were about to die. They're literally playing soccer. I mean, that's what aid is. It's about saving life. It's about saving these kids so they can continue to play soccer. And then have a life, and then have education. And I think that's the story we need to say. And I think even for those who are very critical of humanitarian assistance and the UN, even some of the values the UN are different, they also have their own values. They have their religious values. And I never heard anyone in the US, in Europe, in any country where I travel, saying we shouldn't save a kid.
And I mean, it's true that we have to just come back to the fundamentals, that there is so much more that unites us. People are people rather than divides us. I'm very conscious of the time. We're kind of at time, but I'm going to take 2 minutes, and this is a rapid fire because I really want to get some concrete solutions in the room. Okay, I'm going to ask you each question. This is a rapid fire. You need to give me a one-word answer. So hypothetically, if you had a magic wand, Anjali, what is one thing you'd like to see governments around the world do today to move the needle on the next chapter for humanitarianism?
Focus on funding community-based initiatives like the emergency relief rooms in Sudan.
Nadia?
Other governments around the world should step up and step in with foreign assistance, not look at the model that this US administration is setting at the moment.
Aurelian?
I have my organization talking points. Just allocate 1% of defense budget to humanitarian assistance, and we'll address all humanitarian needs in the world.
Realistically, realistically, that was hypothetically. Realistically, what's one thing your organization can do right now today to move the needle?
Right now, to move the needle, we need to do very concretely what I said before. We need to open our doors, let people we serve in, and drive the system, and us being supporting them, not the other way around.
Nadia?
As Amnesty International, tell the stories of those human lives and get people to care.
Anjali?
Be loud about upholding our values and be transparent about what we know and don't know.
Okay, last question. I've got 60 seconds before I hand it over to the audience. What's one thing people in the audience can do right now today to move the needle on the next chapter for humanitarianism?
Have a conversation with someone you know about why aid and humanitarianism are important. Most people, as you said, right? Most people don't want to live in a world where they are like set against their neighbor. They want to live in a world where they live in comfort with their neighbor.
Nadia?
Where you can, tell your government that you want your government to play a particular role in the world and want to feel pride in your country, whether it's the US or other, being part of a global society and being an actor for good and for human rights.
Aurelian?
I have three. First, make your voice heard. In this world where very extreme discourse are dominating, it's important that you make your voice heard and share your values. Second, if you want to go a step further, fund us. You have many good organizations, you and others. And if you really are committed to this, just join us, get a job with us.
Excellent. Okay, well, we've covered a lot of things. Money, we've talked about, the power structures, we've talked about attitudes.
Job opportunities.
And people feeling disempowered. I hope you all feel that you have more power. I have many more questions, but I'm going to open it up to see what we've got from the audience. Alex?
Thank you very much. Lots in the audience, lots in the virtual audience today. So I just want to read off a list of countries where this is being watched right now. Sierra Leone, Sudan, Kenya, Canada, India, Uganda, Morocco, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Ukraine, Zimbabwe, Kazakhstan, Somalia, Colombia, Egypt, Vietnam, Ghana, and Liberia. And the question from the audience, this has come up a few times in a few different contexts. What new approaches to humanitarian aid do you see as the most promising in the context of increasing climate crises?
Who wants to take that?
Maybe I can have a crack at it. I think that's what's really promising, and what we're working on right now is two things. First, it's how we use AI and new technology to do some disaster forecasting. And that's really a revolution. It's how we predict disasters, but also their humanitarian consequences. So that's really important. And related to that, it's how we establish a system to manage these risks, including, for instance, working with insurance companies of others to make sure that people who may be impacted get supported well before even the disaster strikes.
Great. Is there any, do we have any questions from the audience? And then I might go back online. I'm going to go to you over there.
I'd just like to thank you guys again. And I'd like to, you mentioned a little bit about passing over, shortening the span of humanitarian work to pass over to development organizations. So I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the triple nexus. I know a lot of things have been signed and it's a lot of rhetoric and talking points, but what's actually being operationalized on the ground in this transfer? And then slightly additionally, how does peace building and adding that part of the nexus complicate humanitarian work and development work as well? Thank you.
Nadia, do you want to take that, or Anjali?
I feel like that's a question for someone.
Yeah, I think it is a usual work.
Thank you for passing me before. No, look, there's been a lot, and I think about Niger, the Philippines, where humanitarians, governments, of course, of the countries concerned, and development actors have come together, and communities, of course, and rethought completely the way aid was being structured. I think the challenge with the triple nexus is the type of environments we work in. Today, if you take, for instance, the IFI, the World Bank, the IMF, it's extremely complicated for them to start working in very unstable countries. And this is the bread and butter of humanitarians. Mm-hmm. So we have this problem of being stuck in contexts with no development prospect, with no peace and security prospects, which make humanitarian crises last much longer than they need to. So I think the debate or the direction we should take in the discussion with development actors and government and member states is how we become a bit more flexible on the development side and IFI side. So these actors can engage a bit earlier on, or a lot earlier, in fact, in this context.
Just say one more point on the peace building and humanitarian aid in that context. I think it's really important to understand that, you know, going back to Gaza, humanitarians cannot be a target, right? And this was something that I think sparked outrage around the world when we saw that humanitarian assistance was being used as a tool, as a weapon, and that humanitarian actors themselves were being targeted, and that international humanitarian principles and law was not being upheld. So I just want to remind everyone of these principles that do exist, and that in times of conflict, in times of peace, humanitarian aid should be getting to those who most need it and should be able to function regardless of what that environment is looking like. Obviously, with security in mind and all of that, but yeah.
I'm so glad you brought it up, because I want to ask you all a question, and it's very important, and then I will come to you for the last question. And again, let's keep an eye on the time, because I do want to get her question in. But this is very important. We need to talk about accountability, right? And a lot of people feel very hopeless, not just with Gaza, but looking at everything around the world. And we've talked a lot about some ways that we can make things change. We've talked a lot about other, areas of the world where things are going on in a good way. But in Gaza specifically, people feel like their voices aren't being heard, where they are trying to actually take rights of redress. Whether you agree or not with the ICC, it's still a court of law that needs to follow a procedure, right? Or even when people are calling their congressman, we have seen international law been violated for various reasons. And how can we make sure that actors are held accountable? And if not, then what happens to the actual structure of aid? This is a question for all of you, but Nadia, I'll start with you.
Well, I think it is really important to see how international law has been undermined so dramatically, and how actors have been able to act with impunity in this moment, and what the impacts of that are. We've seen the impact of this genocide in Gaza in particular, but we also can understand what the impacts are for other actors, right? What does it tell Russia that there's impunity when there are war crimes? What does it tell, other actors around the world? And so impunity has knock-on effects. It's not just about that one particular context. But I think there has been so much global outrage, and we should see that as a positive thing. And for people to understand and place their outrage in the right places. It's outrage at the governments that are allowing for that impunity and who are not supporting accountability, rather than outrage at international laws themselves. So how can we translate that outrage into meaningful action and get governments around the world to really support accountability? Accountability for international law being violated wherever it has been violated. So whether that has been by Israeli authorities, by Palestinian militant groups, by Russian authorities, and hold a common standard so that we can go back to that idea of universality, of rule of law, of rule of international law, that it applies to everyone regardless of who they are.
And Anjali, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I mean, this also goes to the triple nexus question, I think. Ultimately, international law is political, right? And so too are, like, when we think about what produces both accountability and lasting solutions to conflict, political solutions produce both of those things. International law only works when powerful actors want it to work. And as a result, what we essentially need is to help leaders understand that the calculus they have to make is one in which there are going to be political consequences for not abiding by international law. But then, of course, the problem becomes that we have to find a way to produce those kinds of consequences, right? And that's obviously like a varied playing field around the world and sometimes even domestically. Yeah.
And Aurelian, what about, what do you think in terms of how can the UN help enforce those consequences?
No, first, I mean, I agree with Nadia that what happened in Gaza will have ripple effects across crises, and it already has. We already hear parties to conflict in other contexts telling us, why are you coming to us? This is what's happening in Gaza. And accountability is a key tool, both in terms of serving justice, but also preventing further violation. So we need to work on that. Now, I used to say that, IHL was buried somewhere in the ruins of Gaza or Darfur, and we need to resuscitate it. And I think there's two angles we need to take from the UN side. First is our work with member states at the political level. I mean, clearly the multilateralism is reshaping right now, and there are different views. We need to make sure that the conversation of international law is not lost in the middle of that, and that member states remain convinced that it's in their interest to have international humanitarian law, especially at a time where the risks of conflicts between states is rising very rapidly. And related to that is also the role of citizens and like us to really make this understand to our governments. I think in our societies, especially Western societies, we have lost sight of the fact that tomorrow it can be us. It can be your family, it can be my family, it can be us who have to live overnight with our kids and cross a continent because our house was bombed and our father was detained. And that's where we need to take the discussion. We need to come with an agreement, a consensus that's in everyone's interest, states, citizens, to have some boundaries in the way wars are being waged.
Which comes back to people taking it for granted because they haven't had to actually face that themselves. But, citizens do have power. It's so easy to feel hopeless, but I think that we wouldn't have seen some of the progress that we've seen if it wasn't for the outrage and for people's voice being heard. So I hope that you'll be encouraged by that. We have 2 minutes left for your last question.
Oh, thank you. You all talked about this vaguely, but you mentioned localization, and with reimagining aid systems, I think about the Rohingya people where localization may be a little bit more difficult. However, with administration changes and potential donor fatigue, do you all think that localization will play a larger role in reimagining aid systems in the future and the potential positive or negative effects of that?
I can just start by saying that I think that it is really important that we keep that idea up because we're at a moment where, at least in this country, this administration is seeing aid, I mentioned this earlier, more as transactional and more about an America First approach. What do we need? What do we need as the United States? And while aid for this country and policymakers throughout US's history have always had an America First as well mentality, it was America First and let's do good. And I think that is a big concern when you look at it against localization. So if you take back that idea of philanthropists now coming in. Imagine every single agency, a philanthropist, US government, French government, UK government, Canada, all were coming in with their own agendas. What would that do for efficiency in a country? What would that do for ensuring aid was getting to the most people who needed it? So I think it's just so much more important now, given the trends that we're seeing, that we are centering that idea of localization, of transparency, accountability, and community participation.
And investing in people, not handouts.
No, and to add, I mean, completely agree with you, Nadia, as some states, want to take more, are becoming more assertive about their sovereignty. As donors says to this state, well, you should take care of yourself. I think localization is the way to go. It's also a demand from communities themselves. So we need to hear that, and our systems are already adapted. So for instance, at OCHA, We have humanitarian funds. I mean, these funds are already redirecting funds towards local organizations. We also need to change the way we work on the ground. You know, very practical things. I mean, in many contexts, international meetings between international organizations are not translated in local languages. It's a tiny bit, but that's a matter. It's very important if you want to include locals into that, and maybe we can use new technology to do this better. While we do that, I think, again, it's important first not to throw the baby with the bathwater. I mean, first, it's not locals against international. I don't think that's the way it is. I think there's a role for everyone. We also need to acknowledge that some local organizations, in some contexts, particularly in conflicts, are more vulnerable than international organizations, and that it's good sometimes to have international organizations help them make their case. And then I'll come back to this idea of values and moral compass. I mean, our job is still to make sure that those who suffer most receive assistance and protection. So any systems driven by local actors also needs to integrate that, and that's what we need to work together with these actors.
And also to really address the underlying reasons for why this huge inequality exists in the first place, and coming back to the climate question, which causes a lot of these things, rather than just trying to treat the symptoms of it. Look, we are at time. I just want to thank the panelists. I mean, humanitarianism is such a huge topic because it's so different, not just in each country, but, you know, in each specific situation. And we have touched upon a wide variety of things, but we have got some little solutions that have been dotted in there. And I hope that you guys know this is just the beginning of a conversation, not the end. They are all accessible. If you have ideas or questions, I'm sure they would be adaptable. And I want to thank you all for the time. Thank you for listening. Thank you.